Nobody should have been looking at her that way, from across the dusty Wyoming prairie. It seemed like an older cowboy had dropped to one knee before a frightened young black woman sitting alone on a sunburned boulder, her torn dress hanging loosely around her shoulders while she clutched herself against the cold despite the summer heat. To anyone passing by, the scene looked suspicious, almost scandalous, but Jared never moved an inch closer than she would allow. His weathered horse waited quietly behind him while the wind carried dry grass across the empty land, and he simply removed his ranch coat, placed it on the rock beside her. Hans spoke in the calm voice of a man who had learned long ago that broken people feared sudden kindness almost as much as cruelty. "Ma'am," he said softly, "nothing bad is going to happen to you today." The woman hesitated before wrapping the coat around herself. Her hands trembled so badly she could barely pull it closed. She had been running since before sunrise, barefoot through cactus, wire fences, and dry creek beds until her legs finally refused to carry her any farther. Jared had seen fear before. Years earlier, the war had taught him what violence looked like long after the blood had dried. But something about this woman's silence unsettled him more than any battlefield ever had. She kept glancing toward the empty road as though expecting someone to appear at any moment. Then, after a long pause, she whispered only 2 words, "Just look." She slowly turned her body, careful not to uncover more than necessary, revealing deep bruises stretching across her shoulder and along her back, old wounds layered beneath fresh ones like pages in a terrible diary. Jared didn't stare. He looked only long enough to understand exactly what he was seeing. Those weren't injuries from a fall or an accident. They were the marks of someone who had lived in fear for a very long time. His jaw tightened, not from anger alone, but from the familiar weight of recognizing suffering that decent people had chosen not to see. He quietly stepped backward again, giving her even more space instead of less. "Who did this?" he asked. At first, no answer came. Then her lips trembled around a single name, Harold Mercer. The name settled heavily between them. Jared knew it immediately. Harold Mercer owned one of the largest cattle ranches in the county, a respected businessman in public, and a man whose reputation always seemed just clean enough to avoid serious questions. Jared looked down the empty road and then back at the frightened woman, realizing this story had only begun before he could speak again. An old ranch widow named Eleanor Briggs rode into the yard carrying supplies from town. One glance at the woman's condition was all it took. Eleanor gently helped her inside the cool shade of the barn while Jared waited outside, respecting the privacy she deserved. Several minutes later, Eleanor returned, her normally steady face unusually pale. "It's worse than you think," she whispered. Jared nodded slowly. He already suspected that inside the barn, the young woman finally introduced herself as Naomi. She admitted she was Harold Mercer's wife, and confessed that every time she tried to leave, he convinced the town she was unstable, claiming she stole from him or wandered away confused. Nobody ever believed her because Harold always reached them first. Jared crouched near the doorway, careful not to invade her space. "Do you have family?" he asked. Naomi shook her head. "Anyone who might take you in?" Another slow shake. "Then we'll let the truth speak instead." Jared answered quietly. Naomi looked at him with frightened disbelief. "He'll come after me." Jared glanced toward the distant road shimmering beneath the afternoon heat. "Yes," he replied honestly, "he probably will." Less than an hour later, 3 riders appeared through the dust exactly as Naomi feared. Harold Mercer led them without hurry, sitting tall in the saddle with the confidence of a man who had spent years believing no one would ever challenge him. He stopped several yards away, never bothering to dismount. "That woman belongs with her husband," he called calmly. Jared remained where he stood, one hand resting loosely beside his holster, but making no move toward it. "The only person standing on this land," Jared answered, "is someone who chose to stay here." Harold smiled thinly. "You don't know the whole story." Jared's eyes never left him. Then let's ride into town together and tell it where lies don't last very long. One of Harold's hired hands climbed from his horse and started toward the barn. Jared moved with quiet precision, lifting a long wooden fence rail from the ground and striking the man's forearm before he reached the doorway. The weapon fell harmlessly into the dust. The second rider hesitated immediately. Harold watched without speaking, studying Jared more carefully now. For several long seconds, neither man reached for a gun. Finally, Harold eased his hand away from his revolver. "Fine," he muttered. "We'll settle it in town." The ride to the sheriff's office was silent, except for hoofbeats. But Jared noticed something troubling the moment they arrived. Harold's younger brother was already sitting outside the building, speaking comfortably with a deputy. The story had reached town before Naomi ever had inside. Harold confidently repeated the familiar lie that his wife was unstable and had wandered away after stealing money from the ranch. Naomi almost lost hope before she spoke a single word. Jared never interrupted or raised his voice. Instead, he calmly described the condition in which he had found her, the bruises he had witnessed, the torn clothing. The fear that no honest person could fake Eleanor Briggs quietly confirmed everything she had seen inside the barn. The sheriff listened carefully, not to the loudest voice in the room, but to the smallest details that refused to fit Harold's story. Then something unexpected happened. Harold's own ranch foreman lowered his eyes and admitted he had witnessed years of abuse but had been too afraid to speak. Because Mercer owned nearly every job in the county, one witness became. Two became three. Soon the carefully constructed lie began collapsing under its own weight. By sunset, Harold Mercer was led away in handcuffs, and for the first time in years, Naomi walked through a doorway without looking over her shoulder. Weeks passed. She remained on Eleanor's ranch, while rebuilding a life she thought had disappeared forever. She learned to ride again without fear, laughed without apologizing for it, and slowly stopped flinching every time someone spoke her name. One quiet evening, she stood beside Jared beneath the same cottonwood tree where they had first met. "When I told you to look," she said softly, "I thought you were only going to see everything that had been broken." Jared looked across the open Wyoming land before answering. "No." "Ma'am," he replied, "I saw the part of you that refused to stay broken." She smiled for the first time without fear in her eyes. The wind moved gently through the tall grass, carrying away a silence that had lasted far too many years. And in that moment, both of them understood something that no courtroom ever could. Sometimes justice begins the instant one decent person chooses to truly look.